Next, to another individual who has committed his life to his ideals. In 2022, Kenneth Roth left Human Rights Watch after 30 years at the helm, during which the organization grew dramatically, conducting investigations in more than 100 countries to uncover abuses. Speaking to Walter Isaacson, Roth discusses his new book, which digs into his 3 decades leading the charge for human rights. And they also speak about the major challenges today. Here's their conversation.
Thank you, Paula and Kenneth Roth. Welcome back to the show.
Very nice to be with you.
You've led Human Rights Watch for 30 years, and now you're out with a book about it. It's called Righting Wrongs, 3 Decades on the Front Lines Battling Abusive Governments. Take us back to what first inspired your interest in human rights.
A big part of it was my father's experience. He fled Nazi Germany in July 1938 as a 12-year-old boy heading to New York. And so I grew up with Hitler stories of what it was like to be a young Jewish boy living under the Nazis. And that made me very aware of the evil that governments could do and made me determined to devote my life to try to stop that kind of conduct.
Are we backsliding now from the human rights fight?
Well, this is clearly a difficult moment in the sense that, Trump has arrived, the autocrats feel emboldened. But I actually think it's a complicated time for autocrats. The 2 most prominent ones, Vladimir Putin and Xi Jinping, have both made big mistakes because they operate in an echo chamber with no debate allowed. Putin invaded Ukraine. Xi Jinping is destroying the economy. When you look around the world, people living under autocracy don't want it. They come into the streets at risk of arrest or even being shot. And, sometimes they succeed in places like Bangladesh or Sri Lanka. Other times they don't. In Belarus, Russia, Uganda, Hong Kong. But the people make their preferences clear. I think the real challenge today is in established Western democracies, where people who feel left behind, that democracy is not delivering to them, that they're not respected, they're not heard, are ripe for the autocrats' appeal. And I think the real challenge now is to bolster the established democracies. The people who live under autocracies don't want it. It's the people in democracies who are having second thoughts.
Are you talking about the United States?
Well, certainly the United States, but if you look throughout Europe, the far-right parties are doing well. Often, most typically they don't gain power, with the exception of Hungary with Viktor Orban, but they are threatening. And that, I think is a concern, and it speaks to the difficulty these governments have of really answering to the day-to-day needs of their entire society.
I always think of you and Human Rights Watch in places like China or Russia where there's, gross violations of human rights. Do you think the human rights community should be involved in Western Europe elections now?
Well, the human rights community has been involved in the West. We always have. The idea that democracies don't violate human rights, that's just not true. Think back to the George W. Bush administration, the systematic torture, the sending people to Guantanamo for endless detention without charge or trial. So yes, we do have to monitor Western democracies, and that's not even talking about, how they wage wars. If you look at how Israel has conducted itself in Gaza. So there, we are an equal opportunity monitor and reporter, and we've got to look, at the classic autocrats, but also at the established democracies.
You just said about how Israel has waged war in Gaza. Let me read you something. You said, no one can justify a war crime by contending that the other side committed war crimes too. I assume you were talking about Israel. Is that what happened there? And what could we have done?
Well, that is a basic rule of international humanitarian law, the Geneva Conventions and their like, which is, because in war, everybody charges the other side with war crimes. And so if that were enough to justify your own war crimes, there quickly would be no protection for civilians. But the rule is that, even if one side, say Hamas, committed war crimes on October 7th, which it did by killing and abducting civilians and holding them for months on end, that does not justify Israel's own war crimes. It's indiscriminate bombardment, it's attacks with hugely disproportionate civilian consequences, the starvation strategy, the destruction of hospitals. So it's important to keep that distinction straight and to monitor each side by the terms of international humanitarian law.
What should we have done?
Well, I think Joe Biden never really used the leverage that he had. He pressed the Netanyahu government to, end its starvation strategy, to pay more attention to the bombing and the toll that was taking on civilians. The only thing he did was to suspend the delivery of these huge 2,000-pound bombs that were decimating neighborhoods. But otherwise, he continued the military aid, he continued the arms sales, and Netanyahu thought that, okay, I'll put up with a few verbal protests, but he's not stopping me. He could have been much tougher and could have saved many, many lives.
You've written, too, about it that no aspect of our work was more closely scrutinized than our reporting on Israel. And I think it rebounded on you personally at times. You had to deal with it. Tell me about that.
Yes. Well, there is no country out there that has a more organized group of defenders than Israel. So at Human Rights Watch, we knew that every time we published something critical about Israel, we would be lambasted. That was just life. And so I personally scrutinized everything we put out to make sure that it was factually accurate, that it was principled in its application of humanitarian or human rights standards, that we were applying the same standards as every place else in the world. And once it passed my scrutiny, we put it out. When I was then accused of being anti-Semitic, which is a very common criticism, I would say, you're cheapening the concept of anti-Semitism. This is a very important concept. Jews around the world are endangered by anti-Semitism. But if people think that this just becomes an excuse to defend Israel, you're going to be harming Jews around the world. And it's important to say that. Otherwise, this kind of misuse of anti-Semitism will continue to try to cover up Israeli war crimes and the like.
And you think there have been Israeli war crimes?
Oh, there is no question that there have been Israeli war crimes. I've written extensively on this. The use of these huge bombs to decimate entire neighborhoods is completely contrary to the rules of war that say you've got to target particular military targets, not treat entire neighborhoods as fair game. Similarly, Israel, it's now become clear by just the Israeli media's own reporting, would justify killing up to 20 civilians just to go after one Hamas fighter. That's a clearly illegal war crime, disproportionate attack. And then finally, if you just look at the starvation strategy, the fact that during the current temporary ceasefire, suddenly the food is flowing in, people are okay, just highlights how much the starvation up until the beginning of this temporary ceasefire was a deliberate Israeli policy.
And I know that can't be justified by Palestinian war crimes, but what did you think when you saw this past week when the bodies of the Israeli hostages and the way they were treated and how they were returned?
Hamas is despicable. I never defend Hamas. They're a military dictatorship in Gaza. The atrocities they committed on October 7th were horrible. They should never have been holding the hostages. They've been mistreating them. They've been forcing them to go through these, charades to demonstrate Hamas's power. All of that, much of that is a war crime itself. But as I mentioned, that does not justify Israel's own war crimes, just as, Hamas's tendency to hide behind civilians, to use human shields, does not relieve Israel of the responsibility still not to launch indiscriminate attacks, not to attack when the harm to civilians will be disproportionate.
And what do you think in terms of human rights issues of the plan Trump has been pushing, I think, to clear Palestinians out of Gaza?
Yeah, this would be, not only a massive war crime, it would be a crime against humanity. Article 49 of the Fourth Geneva Convention prohibits forcibly deporting or expelling the civilian population of occupied territory. Trump is just ripping that up and saying, let's do it anyway. Now, the rest of the Arab world is saying, no way. They remember 1948, the so-called Nakba, or catastrophe, where Palestinians were forced out of the new state of Israel, given a one-way ticket, and never allowed back. That clearly, as Trump has said, is the plan with the 2 million Palestinians that are living in Gaza today. But the rest of the Arab states are saying, no way, we're not going to be complicit in that war crime.
When you talk about human rights abuses, you often focus rightly, I think, on Vladimir Putin and what Russia has done and then what Russia is doing in Ukraine. What would happen if in the next 2 weeks there is a peace imposed, I could say, or maybe just a peace agreed to in the region in which Putin gets to keep a lot of disputed territory and Ukraine is not allowed in NATO?
Well, Walter, I think that, in fact, those two possibilities are quite likely, but that's not really the issue. I don't think anybody feels that it's going to be possible for Ukraine to recapture the territory that Russia has occupied. Formal NATO invitations are just not on the table. But what Ukraine is looking for is a real security guarantee, a guarantee that Russia won't use a ceasefire to just rearm and reinvade in a year or two. And that is what Trump needs to offer. The Europeans are very much willing to put that on the table. But if Trump just says, take the ceasefire, go home, we're not going to worry about anything else, that will be essentially the appeasement, the 21st century equivalent of Neville Chamberlain. That will be a horrible deal that Trump, the supposed master negotiator, would be complicit in.
What is the role of shame that you use in pursuing human rights?
Well, in today's world, every government has to pretend to respect human rights. This is a basic aspect of their legitimacy. Now, we know that many governments don't. And what Human Rights Watch does, in a sense, is shine a spotlight on that discrepancy. We investigate carefully what they're doing, report on the misconduct. And that difference between pretense and reality is embarrassing, it's delegitimizing, and it's shameful. Governments go to great lengths to resist it. Now, it doesn't mean that a dictator has personal remorse. I'm not trying to do, a psychological conversion here. But in order to maintain legitimacy, in order to maintain this pretense that they're serving their people, not themselves, they want to be seen as human rights respecters. That's what gives Human Rights Watch the power to show that that pretense is not reality.
So Human Rights Watch, does it in a private way, fighting for human rights around the world. And I think you sometimes pressure the U.S. government to take stances in favor of human rights. How do you divide up what a non-governmental organization like yourself should do and what you think the U.S. government should do?
Well, Human Rights Watch, in addition to reporting on human rights violations and shining a spotlight of shame on the abuser, we also go to influential governments that purport to support human rights in their foreign policies. Not just the United States, but most of Europe and parts of Latin America and the like. And so that, in a sense, diplomatic side is very important because we will say, okay, what does the target government care about? And how can we deprive them of that until they improve their human rights practices? And they always want something. You got to look at what they want. So it could be, a military aid package. It could be an arms sale. It could be preferential trade benefits. Sometimes it's just getting invited to a fancy summit so they can be photographed with legitimate leaders to show the folks back home that, I'm okay because look who I hang out with. So we will go to the leader of a democratic country and say, don't give them that until they change. Now, traditionally we do this a lot with the US government under Trump. I don't have great confidence, but, we've lived through Trump before and we've done it with others. I described in the book, in fact, I open up an effort to get Putin to stop bombing civilians in Idlib province in northwestern Syria. And this was during the Trump administration, the first one. Trump was not going to be a reliable ally here, but it was by turning to German Chancellor Angela Merkel, French President Emmanuel Macron, and the Turkish President Erdogan, we persuaded those three to pressure Putin to stop bombing hospitals and apartment buildings and markets and the like in Idlib. And it stopped in March 2020. It stopped entirely for 3 years. It revived a little bit after that. And then that was the territory from which this rebel group came to overthrow the Assad government. So that made a huge difference for the people on the ground. They no longer feared death from the skies. And that was possible really because we worked with democracies to put pressure on the target.
You begin your chapter on China by arguing that it's the biggest threat to human rights today. And here's a sentence that was sort of notable. Beijing's actions, if unchecked, portends a dystopian future in which no one is beyond the reach of Chinese censors. Unpack that for me.
Well, the Chinese government is, in my view, the greatest threat because it devotes enormous resources from the world's second largest economy to try to suppress criticism of it around the world. So it's not simply that it represses dissent within China, but it uses the threat of denying access to the Chinese market to censor people around the world. It uses transnational repression. If you're a Uyghur dissident in New York, your parents back at home are going to be threatened if you don't shut up. And so they are really quite ruthless in trying to prevent criticism. They go the next step. They're actually trying to rewrite human rights law. which is quite detailed about, not only things like freedom of the media or free, free speech, the right to due process, also economic and social rights, the right to housing and all. They want to reduce everything to basically, are we expanding the economy? Do we provide security? And are people happy? However they measure that. And this is a kind of a radical dumbing down of the very detailed human rights standards to try to make Xi Jinping look good, to say the economy's growing, that's all you need to know. And that is a real threat to the human rights movement. Nobody else is attempting something so radical.
There have been these cuts in USAID and Doge, Elon Musk going in cutting it. How does the potential decimation of our soft power affect our ability on human rights?
Well, with the global effect of USAID, on the one hand, it's an incredibly important institution to provide, basic healthcare, basic education, basic sanitation, things that people need in poor countries all the time. The other thing that I'm worried about is that by destroying USAID, Trump is essentially giving a gift to autocrats, because a big part of what USAID does, it may not be as widely known, is that it promotes human rights defenders, independent journalists, democracy promoters, the kinds of independent voices that autocrats hate. And a lot of these are being forced to shut down because Trump has turned off the spigot.
Do you think the Human Rights Watch will now take on Donald Trump?
Well, we have to. In other words, if his deportation scheme with undocumented migration leads to, again, family separation or needless detention or various physical abuses against migrants, we're going to have to look at that. If his attacks on DEI reintroduces racial discrimination into the criminal justice system, we have to look at that. And of course, in his foreign policy, I do still think that there are openings to move Trump because, on the one hand, yes, this guy, can't find an autocrat he doesn't want to cozy up to. He flouts human rights standards, but he also sees himself as a master deal maker. And that gives us an opening because if he ignores human rights, he's going to make bad deals. In Gaza, he played a useful role in forcing Netanyahu to agree to the current temporary ceasefire. If he wants his bigger regional deal, the normalization of relations between Saudi Arabia and Israel, he's going to have to push Netanyahu to accept a Palestinian state. If he did that, he would deserve the Nobel Peace Prize. So I think that we can, push him in a positive direction, playing on his ego, playing on his desire for recognition. And, it may or may not work, but I think this is our best strategy to try to make progress.
Ken Roth, thank you for joining us.
Thank you so much for having me. I enjoyed our conversation.